The young preacher got up in the pulpit one Sunday preparing to start his sermon. Now, he had heard one of his professors from seminary begin one of his sermons this way: "The happiest days of my life were spent in the arms of another man's wife." My mother. Young preacher thought, well, that quotation would kind of add a sense of drama and force to his sermon, so he decided to try it. He said, "The happiest days of my life were spent in the arms of another man's wife." At this point, he had a mental block. He was confused, bewildered. He agonized for a moment, and then he said, "The happiest days of my life were spent in the arms of another man's wife, but for the life of me, I just can't remember who it was." Now, just as that young pastor was confused, so were two men walking along the Emmaus Road in our scripture for this morning. Now, you remember the story, right? There was these two travelers. We don't know, were they friends? Maybe were they brothers? Possibly a husband and wife? We're just not told. We are told that one of them was named Cleopas. They were church-going folks, probably just like us, in Jerusalem for the Passover, and also to be near Jesus, whom they were sure was Israel's deliverer, the Messiah. Now they were going home, dejected, depressed, defeated. You see, Jesus had been crucified. He was dead, buried, nothing more to say or do. So they walked and walked, talked, probably some mundane things. Taxes were too high, wages too low, kids too wild. But more than likely, they talked about their friend Jesus, his teaching, his healing, the way he seemed to love everyone, and about the events of the past week. Well, suddenly, Cleopas and his friend aren't alone anymore. Someone is walking along with them. Suddenly, Cleopas looks and sees him, to which he says, "What's up, y'all?" I said that for Dylan's benefit, just so she feel like she could relate. Well, they stop in their tracks and they say, "What's up? What's up? Are you kidding me? Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem that doesn't know the things that have happened here?" Now, of course, we're privy to the information that this is Jesus. But as we listen, we discover that the stranger is not known to these two disciples. Now, I don't know how that happens. It seems pretty peculiar to me that these two disciples of Jesus won't even recognize him. Well, see, we read in verse 16 that their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Well, how did that happen? Well, maybe God put blinders on them so they couldn't actually see Jesus or recognize him through some kind of miracle. And sure, God could have done that. That could have been one. Maybe the sun was in their eyes as they were walking. The sun was descending and going down, and they just couldn't see it. Maybe I think this could be it. Maybe they had poor vision, and without glasses, it had to be a lot of people back then without glasses like mine. And if I take this off, there is no way I can read anything on this paper. So I'm just ad-libbing right now, Glenda. It won't be on there. Because everything that I put is even in like 14 font. Doesn't make any difference. It's just lines on the paper. Oh, okay. Or maybe it could be that he was out of context. You know, he's dead and buried. You don't expect Jesus to just show up. Or maybe he was in disguise. Maybe he had a funny hat on, a wig, glasses with a funny nose, whatever. But it doesn't make any difference. Whatever the result, whatever the reason, the result is the same. They're clueless. And so Jesus walks with them and teaches them. He says, you remember beginning with Moses and all the prophets, and he explains all that. He said, it's what you learned in Sunday school, what you learned in church, those Bible promises, the gospel of God's promises to you. And as he talks, something begins to warm within him, within the disciples. Well, they continue to walk. He continues to teach them, and eventually they reach the town of Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. Sun is beginning to set, so the 2 disciples, still not understanding who Jesus was, invite him to stay and stay with them and have dinner with them. Now, you need to know, in a Jewish home, the host, the man of the house, would take the bread and break it and pass it around the table. That's their job. But this night, Jesus, the text says, is the one who does that. He's the guest in the house, and yet he acts as if he's the host. Luke says, this is what happened. When Jesus was at table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Those words sound familiar to you? They should. They're a lot like the words we use when we have Holy Communion. They describe what Jesus did at the first Lord's Supper. He took the bread, blessed it, broke it, and he gave it to his disciples. And then this is what our text says next. It says, and then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And then Jesus vanished from their sight. Then, even though it's getting late, and it's 7 miles to get back to Jerusalem, these 2 disciples jump up, head on back to Jerusalem, back into the city, and tell the other disciples what they had seen. Pretty remarkable story if you think about it. So let me ask you, are there any parallels between the experience of these 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus and us? Well, of course there has to be, or my sermon would be over. That might make Dave really happy, but I got a few pages to go. All right, so I'm reminded of a story about a man named Conrad. He was a cobbler. He made shoes for a living for people in his village. Well, one winter's day, 2 neighbors come to Conrad's shop to find Conrad in great spirits. His shop is decorated in green bows of all sorts of stuff. It's a beautiful setting. And they ask him, well, Conrad, what's going on? What's the special occasion? And he says, well, I had a dream last night, and in my dream, Jesus said he was going to come to me today and visit. Now, I don't know if his neighbors believed him or not, but they stay a while and then they leave. Conrad then waits for Jesus to appear. What a day. Just imagine, I might have the opportunity to break bread with the risen Lord. Wow. Well, while he was waiting, he sees a beggar walking by with no shoes to protect his feet from the cold. So Conrad goes to a shelf, picks out a pair of shoes that he thinks would fit the poor man's feet, gives them to him. The beggar thanks him and leaves. Later, he sees an old woman bent over with a heavy load. Moved with compassion again, he invites the woman in to share bread with her, the bread that he was actually saving to have with Jesus. After she has eaten, she thanks him. She goes on her way. Then Conrad sees just outside of his shop a little child who was lost, alone. He goes and talks to the child, finds out that she's lost and she doesn't know how to get home, so brings her in, gives her a cup of milk, and then helps her to find her mother into her mother's waiting arms. Conrad returns to his shop, and then he waits, and he waits, and he waits. Finally, as the sun begins to set, he sadly prays, well, Jesus, I've been ready for your visit. Well, I guess you forgot me. To which Jesus replies, of course, as we all would know by now, hey, Conrad, I kept my word. 3 times I came to your door, once as a beggar, once as an old woman, and once as a lost child. And 3 times you greeted me with compassion. Bless you. And Conrad smiles. Truth is, like the disciples at Emmaus, he walked with the risen Lord that day, without even knowing it. And like them, at the end, his eyes were opened and his heart was warmed. I don't know about you, but for those of us, I believe, who participated in the Faith in Action projects this weekend. When we were done, our hearts were warmed. At the Feed My Starving Children that we did, where we packed food, they show a photo of one of the children that they began helping from a couple of years, or actually just a year ago. Thin, gaunt, almost looks like he's ready to starve to death. And then just a year later, after having this food, how strong he looked and how healthy. That's the face of Christ. See, the last thing that Cleopas and his companion expected to see on that dusty road to Emmaus was Jesus. They weren't prepared for the Christ of the commonplace. Now, I'll bet that if the two disciples on that road had failed to show hospitality to Jesus, if they'd failed to insist that he stay with them, that they would have missed that great blessing. They would have eaten dinner that night in silence. They'd have gone to bed wondering what to think. But that's not what happened, is it? They showed kindness to that stranger. They invited him to have dinner with them, to stay overnight, to enjoy the pleasure of their company instead of a lonely night alongside the road. And it was at that dinner that their eyes were opened. On any given Sunday in contemporary America, modern versions of Cleopas come walking down the road, finally turning in and entering the church. The powerful, the powerless, the boss, the employee, the highest, the lowest, each with their own problems, each yearning for the presence of the risen Lord, and occasionally even finding him here. But, like the two disciples, there is danger. The danger that once you leave this hallowed place, that you might be too preoccupied, too busy, too stressed out to actually recognize him, Jesus, out in the world as well. And that's sad. Because the truth is, the risen Lord is wherever he is needed, even with us, and even if we don't know that that is the case. I wonder, is the problem that we have most likely, like those two disciples, left Jesus in the tomb? And did you notice in the story that Jesus comes to the disciples, not the other way around? We need to hear the word about the Christ who comes to us. Often we think we must pound on heaven's door to get God's attention. If I just pray enough, if I just get on my knees, if I clean up my life, if I serve the church, then maybe God will notice my situation. Maybe then God will open the door. But the picture of the New Testament, the picture the New Testament gives us is not our pounding on God's door, but Christ gently knocking on ours. We're the ones with the attention problem. Christ continually comes to us, but like those two disciples on the road to Emmaus, most often we don't recognize him. Author Nelson Searcy tells of visiting Disney World with his son some years ago. It was a magical time for them. What they didn't realize until it was almost time for them to leave the theme park was that the people who first designed the Disney parks did something quite creative. They hid discrete images of Mickey Mouse throughout all the Disney parks and various attractions. The images are just simple three circles. And the first two for his ears and then for his head, and you've seen those. Just three interconnected circles that outline Mickey's head. They are everywhere in the park. They're etched into the pavement, painted on the sides of the walls of the rides, built into the fences, arranged in the landscaping. Maybe if you haven't noticed those, look for them next time you go to Disneyland or Disney World. Disney World is apparently jam-packed with these images, these subtle, hidden Mickey Mouses. But most people don't see them because they don't know to look for them. Circe and his son sure didn't. They learned about the hidden Mickeys just as they were leaving. However, simple awareness is a powerful thing. When Circe and his son said their final goodbye to Dumbo after riding that ride and learning about the hidden Mickeys and walking towards the parking lot tram, they started seeing hidden Mickeys everywhere. They began popping out of the woodwork, literally. They'd been at the park all day long without seeing a single hidden Mickey, but as soon as they became aware of his existence, they saw him everywhere. Maybe all we need to do is open our eyes to be aware that Jesus is everywhere. One final story. In Winnie the Pooh, Pooh and Piglet take off for an evening walk. After a long time in silence, they walk just like friends who can walk and not have to say anything. Finally, Piglet breaks the silence and says, "When you wake up in the morning, Pooh, what's the first thing you say to yourself?" "What's for breakfast?" answers Pooh, and then asks, "And what do you say, Piglet?" And Piglet says, "I say, I wonder what exciting thing is going to happen to me today. I wonder what exciting thing is going to happen today." Truth is, you and I can't plan to meet the risen Christ because we never know exactly where or when or how he's going to show up. But you can be sure of this. He will show up. If you believe, he will show up. And the minutes and the attitude you need to meet him is the attitude of Piglet. I wonder what exciting thing is going to happen today. Or maybe, more appropriately, I wonder yet where I'll meet Jesus today. It's true, we never know when or where or how he's going to show up, but we know this: he is alive. And Jesus wants to live in the hearts of you and me and those we meet. As you walk along the road, talking about all the things that have come to pass, participating, in other words, in life, the business of living, you just may notice, as you glance out the side of your eye, the corner of your eye, a stranger overtaking you. Maybe at first glance you won't recognize him, but then you will sense a growing warmth as your heart begins to burn within you. And then comes the moment, magnificent and unexpected, when you see who it is. So keep an eye out for Jesus. You might even be able to see him today in the faces of those who are worshiping with you. Or you may get a glimpse of him in your wife, or your husband, or your child, or your neighbor, or the clerk at the supermarket. Once you expect to see Jesus, you'll begin to see him everywhere. Oh, and don't forget to look in the mirror. You'll see a bit of him there, too. Amen. Our